I'm Alice Smith, and I had the privilege to organize this webinar. And I have a few slides of introduction. So let me share my slides here for that. Okay, so this is the name of our webinar, Navigating the Path to Editorial Positions. This came about kind of threefold. I have the honor to serve as an Inform's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Ambassador this year. And my project is about encouraging especially those from underrepresented groups to learn more about becoming engaged with the editorial process and hopefully motivating and enabling some people to begin those steps to either first steps to first be involved with editorial positions or to elevate their positions. And so this webinar is the first event. We also plan a in-person event at the annual conference in November. I'm not sure yet exactly what form that will take. Probably in part depend on feedback from this webinar. This is also co-sponsored by the Inform's Minority Affairs Forum and the Women in ORMS or WORMS Forum. So these are our goals and mission. We're going to have 4 experienced editors along with myself who discuss the roles, how and why they got involved, and give tips and guidance for exploring this aspect of scholarship. And I've said all the other stuff. So let me introduce briefly our 4 panelists. They are going to introduce themselves, but in a more personal and experiential way. And this is alphabetical by last name. So Michael Johnson's our first panelist alphabetically, and he's professor and chair of the Department of Public Policy and Public Affairs at the University of Massachusetts at Boston. He's had, as you can see, some pretty diverse and interesting editorial experience, including at least what resonated a lot with me is with European Journal of Operational Research, EJOR, which for my work is one of the premier places I try to publish in. Second, alphabetically, is Stephen Coe, and he is the Quistrom Professor of Management and Finance at Boston University. And you can see he's been with our, what could be arguably Inform's flagship journal, Operations Research, from 2015. He also has a lot of other editorial experience that you can see there, some of them still current and some in the past. Third is Maria Mayorga, and she is professor of personalized medicine at Department of Industrial and Systems Engineering at North Carolina State University. And likewise, she has quite a few editorial experiences. In Informs, she's an associate editor with Informs Journal on Computing and has had a number of roles with the Institute of Industrial and Systems Engineering, IISE journals, along with some others. And then Karen Smilowitz is the James N. and Margie M. Krebs Professor in Industrial Engineering and Management Science at Northwestern University. And she's a relatively new editor-in-chief of another flagship journal from Inform's Transportation Science. And you can see she's had some other really great editorial experiences. Myself, I am the Joe W. Forehand Accenture Distinguished Professor of Industrial and Systems Engineering. I have a joint appointment in Computer Science and Software Engineering at Auburn University. I have the privilege and pleasure to be the editor-in-chief of Inform's Journal on Computing. I'm in my 3rd year. I'm also an area editor of Computers and Operations Research and have had that role for 8 years. And I've worked on some IEEE journals and some others that you can see there. So scholarship and scholarly publishing and now editorial um, things are one of my big passions. And that's why I proposed this project as a diversity, equity, and inclusion ambassador, because uh, the editorial ranks, not just of Informs, but other places, at least in our technical fields, are underrepresented and needlessly underrepresented, in my view, um, of people of diversity. So hopefully this will help change that. So I want to start with Michael and I've invited each of the panelists to spend about 5 minutes giving a more personal background and perspective. And then we're going to have questions for most of it. So if you have questions, I know we have almost 80 participants online. I think you can just put them in the chat and then we can moderate from there. Okay, so I encourage you to go ahead and start on that. Michael, please, it's your forum right now.
Thanks. Can I share my screen?
Absolutely.
Okay. Now I have to find it where I'm sharing.
It should be at the bottom. It's just
Yep.
yeah, there you go.
Okay, so thank you very much, Alice, for inviting me today. And I'd like to say a few words about my experience in journal editorial service. A few words about myself. I'm educated bachelor's level at Morehouse College in Atlanta, master's at Georgia Tech and UC Berkeley, and finished at Northwestern. My entire academic career has been in schools and colleges and departments of public policy. And I've had the 3 editorial positions that Alice mentioned in her intro. So I thought I'd share a few thoughts about how I got started. And as I was reflecting on this, I realized that I should let people know that your mileage may vary. You should not do what I did necessarily, because it may not work for you. But my temperament is to say yes, because I never know what I could learn. And for me, that was a great entree to getting to know a variety of different journals, to figure out, when being asked to review, to figure out where I fit in the discipline, to see how I could make my mark. As I knew more, I'm more inclined to say no so that I can keep my work aligned with my career priorities. And reviewing is, only the first step towards editorial board service. And it's always good to be strategic and decide, well, where would I like to um, be affiliated at? And that can determine who you will say yes to for reviewing opportunities. And if you say yes enough, people will seek you out for leadership. I've been really fortunate to have that opportunity. And then when you have that opportunity, you can ask, well, what best expresses my scholarly identity? Do I want to publish there? Do I want to encourage other people to publish there? And do I like the work? Am I organized and task oriented? The answer is not always for me, but enough that I can do the editorial work. For me, what I get out of it is an opportunity to influence the direction of the discipline and to evolve my understanding of my place in the discipline. This has been especially true for my work with socioeconomic planning sciences. You see enough papers, you get ideas for special issues. You can expand your domain expertise, meet distinguished people, and increase the impact of the journal. That's also been my experience with SEP, so since the time I've been a part of it. If you're willing to do lots of administrative work, understand how this profession works. And so if you have this idea about how your field ought to evolve, what it can become, then an editorial position can be right for you. And I thought I'd share a few ideas about how I've personally benefited from it. In reviewing papers and managing reviews, I've gotten to understand what is possible in special issues and special sections. And so I've been able to do that for socioeconomic planning sciences, a special issue on indices for the betterment of the public. I was lead co-editor for an Informs Editor's Cut that allowed me to put into practice all the lessons that I've learned serving on editorial boards. And my work as a lead co-editor for a special issue of European Journal of Operational Research actually allowed the editors at EJOR to see what I was interested in and to invite me to join the editorial board. Um, so I am looking forward to even more work on editorial boards in the future, not limited to the three journals that are listed here. I think I'll stop and turn it over to my colleagues. Thanks for your attention.
Hey, thanks, Michael. That was really informative. And next alphabetically is Steve Coe, and so I invite him to take the floor.
Okay, thank you very much. So let me share the screen. Okay. Okay, so good. So can you see my screen?
Mhm.
Okay. So this brief introduction by myself. I got my PhD in 1995 from Columbia University. Then I spent my first few years in the Department of Statistics. Then I spent most of the time from 1998 to 2013 at Department of Industrial Engineering Operation Research at Columbia University. Then 5 years at Math Department at US. Now I'm at the Boston University Finance Department. So that's a brief introduction about myself. In terms of the editorial process, okay, so I want to just spend 1 or 2 minutes talk about the what happens with editorial process. Then, in a way that also invites you to say at which step you can help us, right? So I will give an example based on my experience at being a co-area editor at Operation Research. So when I receive a paper, uh, as an area editor, I will do some initial screening. So typically we will desk reject about half the paper. So 50% paper will not go to either associate editor or referee. I will just say, okay, this is not suitable, or you better send to some other journal, etc. Then when the associate editor get the paper, when the submission passed on to the associate editor, the associate editor also have the choice to either desk reject it or send to some outside referees. So I would say at that time about another 25 to 30% paper will be desk rejected by associate editor. Then what's left will go to multiple referees, probably two most likely, sometimes three referees. The referees will give us report. They will get reminders, etc. So once we get all these reports, the associate editor will make a recommendation, and then I will look at this and make a judgment based on the letters from referees and also recommendations and letters from associate editors. So the decision could be rejection, major revision, minor revision. Um, uh, then if it's a major revision or minor revision, the paper will pass back to the authors for them to revise. They have 1 year to revise. Then after they submit the revision, then the whole process restart again, right? So you have this. Now, the once you understand this process, you can understand, okay, so when we need help, for example, we need people to serve as associate editors. Now, depend on the journals, I involved with several journals, but depend on journals, they will recruit associate editor in different ways. For example, in OR, my experience is for operations typically um, the area editors will pick up the social editors, then the editor-in-chief will agree, and these associate editors will typically serve, I don't know, 2 or 3 years, as long as the associate editor willing to do so, as long as the area editors and the editor-in-chief agrees. Once once there's a replacement of the area editor, the whole board associated will leave, and they might rejoin again. But the thing is, the new associate might come during that time. The area editor may be reappointed, so the associate might also be reappointed. That's for the operation research. So for some other journals, for example, interesting journal is Digital Finance, which I'm also involved, because Digital Finance is a very new journal. So they want to review the reputation, therefore it selects associated quite differently. So what happened is when the editors see people submit paper, and if this turn out to be good paper, accept paper, etc., the editors will encourage the author to consider to be a social editor. This way, you attract more submissions, because it's new journal. You need a lot more submissions, right? So this way, you encourage people to submit paper and to get involved with editorial process, right? One last thing I want to say is, okay, for social editors, most of the time the job is quite normal, because you just review the paper, send out referee, collect opinions. But sometimes it could be quite challenging. For example, you might get papers totally outside your research domain, right? Because let's say, suppose you have 10 social editors. Not every paper submitted fit these 10 associate editors, right? So there will be some odd papers, and one of these associate editors will have to handle the paper. So you have to be willing to handle the papers, not necessarily in your research realm. And also sometimes, despite our busy professional family research activities, we have to be on call. For example, it could happen that there's some papers that have very bad referee process. In other words, you might not get referee report in a timely fashion. At that time, probably the associate editors might have to jump in to write a very detailed report, or in some rare cases, there's some dispute. So the authors might disagree with one associate editor's opinions. So authors ask editor to choose a different associate editor. In that case, we will have to find another associate editor, another set of referees to handle the papers, maybe in a very fast fashion. Okay, so that's the thing you have to prepare. Okay, so I think I stop here.
Okay, thanks a lot, Steve. That was super informative. You can stop your share if you wish.
Okay.
And we'll move to our third panelist, Maria.
Are you seeing the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so a little bit of background about myself. I went to UC Berkeley, and my degree is in industrial engineering and operations research. As you can probably see from the journals that I have worked with, my research interest is in health systems engineering. So I think one thing to note for people who have, both methodological contributions and application areas, that you can think broadly about your opportunities. Maybe there are journals within an application area that you could participate in, and then ones that are more related to the methodological area. Though many journals now also have departments within them, even though they're methodologically focused, that you can participate in. Another thing maybe to note is that as Steve mentioned, there's different roles, and usually before you can get to be a department editor or area editor within a journal, you kind of start at the associate editor position. So there is this trajectory. For the discussion points today, when I was asked how and why I got involved in the editorial process, I thought back to it, and I think, well, I was invited, but you don't get invited by chance, right? So you get invited because you probably served as a reviewer for that journal and also published in that journal. So you would normally get invited to a journal that you are very actively participating in. But that means that you have to take seriously your reviewer roles, because if you get invited to review and you do a poor job of reviewing, poor job, I mean, it doesn't mean that you can't reject papers, right? Poor job, I mean, you don't do it in a timely fashion, or you don't provide a detailed review. So if you think that you might be interested in this, be very careful with your reviews, make them timely, thorough, and also conscientious. Make sure you aren't being rude in your reviews and things like that to the authors. And then why I continue to get involved is because I think it provides excellent visibility to you, because you have to reach out to, as an associate editor, you have to invite reviewers. And that means that a lot of people are getting your emails. So they start to get familiar with your name and associated with that type of research. So it's great at expanding your visibility and also your network. I've met a lot of people as a result of these editorial roles. And it also helps you to learn about upcoming research trends, or, what are the things that people are interested in now? What are people submitting about? So it keeps you up to date with what's going on. So if you're thinking about becoming a journal editor, going back to the points made earlier, you want to serve as a reviewer and you want to publish in those journals. But there's other ways as well. I realized that for my first role, I think I was like on a society, serving as like a board member within a society for somebody else who was working in that journal. And so I kind of became familiar with it. So think about service to informs and within your communities. That might be a way for you to meet people who might then later, when they're looking for people to invite, think of you because they are familiar with your research. And you can, I think there was a question in the chat, like, should I just contact the editor or something like that? I suppose you can let the editors and associate editors, it might be good to let an advocate or a champion for you make that suggestion as well. When people are looking for editors. So like, for example, if somebody contacts me and I say, well, my plate is full right now, I can't take that role on. And they say, well, can you suggest somebody else? If that person knows that you're interested, they might mention your name. But one last thing I want to add is be selective. You know that all journals are not viewed the same. And if you just don't just say yes, well, contrary to what Michael said, I know Michael said that he said yes, but I'm sure he said yes to things that made sense for him. But like, if you get invited to the International Journal of Quilting, maybe you love quilting, but if it's not related to your research, that might not be something that you might want to say yes to. And also, if it doesn't have a very good reputation, it could actually, people might start to question, like, why are you doing these things? And it does take a lot of time and effort. Like Steve said, one of the things is about chasing people down, because you do want to make sure that you get the reviews back in time. So I would say also, when you say yes, think about, do you have the time to commit to it? Because you don't want to do a bad job if you want to continue in that editorial service. So I think I'll stop there.
Thanks, Maria. Those are great insights. Before we get to the last panelist, I want to remind everyone who's attending that we're going to spend a good part of this webinar answering your questions and discussing them. So please, we've already got several, but please start typing questions or discussion points in the chat. Just address them to all panelists, and that would be great. So don't be shy. So last but not least, I invite Karen to take the floor.
Great, thanks. I love batting cleanup because I'm going to borrow bits and pieces from all the presentations that you've seen, because you've all kind of set it up. I do want to say one thing. I told Alice I would embarrass her, and I will. because I think this is a continuum. We're talking a lot about if you want, if you want an editorial position, I think it's also important to think about how you bring other people up. And so about a year ago, Alice and I had a conversation because I had been nominated for editor-in-chief of transportation science. And I didn't even know what an editorial statement looked like. I had a lot of questions. And Alice and I had at least an hour-long conversation early in the pandemic. And it was one of the most valuable conversations of my career. So thank you, Alice. Because it really builds off. So Maria and Michael talked about this issue of when to say yes, when to say no. I want to talk a little bit about conditional yeses, and that kind of gets to my conversation with Alice. And I'm telling you, batting cleanup is the best. So Stephen showed you kind of that editorial process. At Transportation Science, we were reaching about 500 submissions a year, and we still only had an editor-in-chief and associate editors. Whereas Stephen talked about, like, at Operations Research and at larger journals, you have this middle layer of either area or department editors. And we had talked about it a lot at Transportation Science, but our submissions were going up. So it's really hard to change your editorial structure when you're the editor-in-chief and you've got submissions going up. And so when I talked to Alice, I said, I want this job, but I'm worried that we need to do this restructuring, but the volume's so high. And so I want to hit, when I start on January 1st, I want the new structure in place, which is a bold statement to say when you don't even have the job yet. And Alice gave me the confidence to write a statement that said, this is how I want the structure to be if you want me. If you select me for the job, this is what I want. And it was a fantastic conversation. Not only did she give me confidence, but there were just things I didn't even know to include in the statement. So it was great. And so I want to thank her for that. But I also want you to think about this idea of conditional yes. Like, this is obviously what it means when you're an editor-in-chief, but you could even do that as an associate editor. And so one of my first jobs when I was editor-in-chief was inviting new associate editors. And you absolutely can go back and say, what is the workload? There's one of my favorite associate editors now, he sent me this incredibly long list of questions about what this role would entail. The questions were fantastic, which actually became our AE guide. We had kind of been thinking about having a guide for associate editors that went through the whole process and talked about workload and, even questions like, well, what percentage of papers do you just reject? And just kind of things that you wouldn't know if you've never been an associate editor. And so answering these questions for him created the basis of what became our AE guide. So I wanted to kind of hit that point because I do think this idea of you do want to say yes, but you need to kind of think about not overextending, because you absolutely, if you want an associate editor job, you want to do really a great job with your reviews. That's really where we look for AEs. So kind of think about what reviews you want to do, what associate editor jobs you might want, and when you're doing reviews, I will make one comment on reviews is don't go for the laundry list of everything that's wrong on the paper, because you want to write your reviews like you're going to be a good associate editor. What are the biggest issues? Like, is this a good paper? Yes or no? And then what are the big concerns? So really some of the journalist stuff, this is something we just adopted from MSOM, is a review template. And so look at these templates because it really is a good guide to think about how do you write a good review, which then helps you think about how do I write a good AE report or an area ed report kind of as you move up. So that's kind of, I think everything. I want to add one more comment to what Maria had. I loved her list of service. And I think it's in particularly to this group of worms and NIF, we get asked to do a lot of service. But I think service kind of gets into like two categories. There's like the selfless service that you just do. And then there's, I'm going to call it the selfish service for lack of a better word. And I think Maria's list showed why this is really good service. It's really good service for your career. I think that I'm not going to repeat all the great things that Maria had. One I would add is it also makes you a better writer. I think you have a better chance of getting your papers published when you see the process from the other side. So I spoke really fast, but Alice, I want to turn us over to questions.
Okay, thanks, Karen. Yeah, there was a lot packed in there, and we'll just dissect some of that. So again, the attendees, please put questions. We've got some coming in, but we encourage more. So I think I'll start with a question that's pretty obvious, but it's been posed, and about the time commitment. Editorial work is time consuming and mostly not paid. Well, I'd say almost wholly not paid, at least in our field. Um, there's not a money motivation, let me say that, or if it is, I'm working for the wrong journals. So what about the time commitment? So I guess I'll ask maybe each of our panelists to do that, because that's such a fundamental point, and not just the amount of time, but how it flows. Is it steady? Is it in chunks? Can you control it? How do you manage it? And so let me just stop there and I'll just work backwards then. How about that? And so I'll start with Karen, if you want to talk about, and I know editor in chief, but you've done it a year now, so you probably have a pretty good feel for that.
Yeah, I would say, this year is an exception. Both, the 6 months prior to taking over, the reorganization was a tremendous amount of time. And then the first 6 months of the job has been a tremendous amount of time. I would say as an associate editor, being organized is good to have, because this is a hard question to ask now. I think the more senior you get, the more papers you get. So it is, every 2 weeks, I would say half a day. I don't know if I'm saying these numbers. It's just kind of consistently. I'm botching this question because I think the last year has been odd. So I'm going to hand this over to someone else.
Okay, so you didn't keep a clock. I will, yeah. All right, so Maria, what's your take on time commitment and how you manage it?
It does take a lot of time, and I love that, Karen, you had that person ask you. I started to do that because I realized at first, when you just do one journal, you think they're all going to operate the same, but then you realize that they don't all operate the same, so the volume can be quite different between them. So I have now gotten into the habit of, before taking anything on, asking, and then if it seems excessive, I've actually asked to say, well, because this was during COVID, I said, well, I can start, but I need a reduced load for this time period, or I can start next year. And so don't be afraid to ask, I think, is the key takeaway. But the other thing is, I think you do need to be, that's why you need to be selective. I think it's better to do a good job with a few roles to journals that people are going to admire that you're on that role, rather than taking a bunch on. So I think quality versus quantity in this case. And so that somebody asked in the chat, like, why do you do this if you don't get paid? Well, as you go further along, first of all, it is kind of service back to the community, right? Because somebody's got to review the papers, and you want people to review your paper, so you kind of also have to serve in this role. The other thing is that it does give you a lot of visibility, and sometimes there's opportunities to shape direction, like Michael said, with these special issues, that you can kind of maybe put together special issues or talk about what we're doing now. How can we diversify the editorial board? So there are some things, but it is mostly a selfless task, but it's not as selfless as other things you might do. So like Karen said, it is something you can at least put in your CV and that people will look at. And I think as you get further along, you're expected to do more. Someone asked a question about, should you do this pre-tenure? And I think very carefully, yes, but not in high volume would be my suggestion for that.
Okay, yeah, that's really good advice, Maria. Steve, do you have anything to add about the time commitment and time management aspect?
Sure. I can talk about my personal experience. So I end up spend about 1 day a week doing all editorial works. So in other words, typically I do editorial work on Friday. So Friday essentially is the whole day from morning to the afternoon, because I'm involved with 2 journals as area editors. So for the OR, I get about 80 to 90 papers a year. And for the other journal, Digital Finance, I get about 40 papers a year to handle although for digital finance, I only get 40 papers, but because it's a new journal, so I have to do a lot of promotion, fund associate, etc. Then I also do some associated jobs for some other journal like Mass Finance, etc. So I would say about, let's say about 1 day a week. So let's say 6 to 7 hours. Okay, that's typically the workload for the things I do. I guess the work sometimes can be even more because if nothing goes wrong, for example, there's no dispute, and you just make recommendation according to what associate editor or the referee says, that's quite easy. But sometimes if there's a dispute, okay, and also sometimes the two referees give you one positive, one negative, that will end up taking lots of time. Okay, so the worst case I had was there was one paper, and not only I have to read the paper, but I have to read the paper, one paper cited by the paper, to go back to the original source, says that what's the contribution of this new paper related to that, end up taking more than 1 day. Okay, so just that paper alone. So it depends, but roughly speaking, that's the workload. Okay.
All
So
right,
I guess
thanks.
that's kind of stuff. Yeah.
Thanks, Steve. Hey, Michael, I'd like you to comment on the workload, but also we got a question that particularly pertain to you, although others could jump in because your editorialships, as I mentioned when I introduced you, are super diverse. And so the other thing I'd like you to address in this turnaround when you're speaking is, well, I'll just quote it. What would you say to junior faculty that want to be on an editorial board that they've been asked to serve on, especially out of research area editorial boards? And so in other words, not their main research area. So if you can also jump on that question, that would be awesome.
All right, thanks. I'll see what I can do. I'm the last person you want to come to talk about time management. I wish I could have 1 day a week for editorial work, but I'm department chair, and so that kind of blows up my schedule. I guess ideally it would be about 3 to 5 hours a week for each journal responsibility, but it's chunky. You know, there are lots of peaks and valleys. For me, the big time sink. Well, so SEPS is an interdisciplinary journal. It's rooted in decision sciences, but we get a lot of papers that could, find reasonable homes in economics, in planning, in urban affairs, just a whole bunch of areas. That kind of suits my temperament because I'm in public policy, though trained in engineering, so I'm used to being at the boundary of different disciplines. But that makes the work a little harder. It takes more time to read a submission and attempt to understand sort of what they're trying to say, and to allow that even if what they're doing is not in my particular bag of tricks, that doesn't mean that it's invalid. It means that I need to extend myself to understand what they were trying to do. So that's one extra time. Then you have to find people to review it. And again, if it's not squarely in your area of expertise, then you've got to go through a lot of unfamiliar names in fields to make sure that they appear to be qualified to review it. And you'll have to make multiple requests. And then you have to, do a lot of follow-up. A third time sink for me is it's related to an ethic that I guess brought with me ever since my undergraduate time at Morehouse College, which is to put a premium on extending opportunities for success to people, always understanding that these are people's careers that we're talking about, and recognizing and rewarding potential and promise. And that means not being so quick to say no. But if you're not going to be quick to say no, it sometimes takes time to get to yes. And it's a value judgment. It's it's quicker to be crisp and to say that's not going to hit it. It takes more time to polish something up, even if it requires an extra round of reviews. So the question in the chat, editorial board work that is out of research area. I think it depends on your training and your temperament. That is, if your training is in a particular sort of discipline, and the work you're doing is tightly aligned with your training, then I would be pretty cautious about taking out of research area editorial positions. You know, our service work is about helping people's careers, but it's also about managing and growing the discipline, expanding our notion of what's correct and what's impactful. And to do that, you have to know what you're talking about. And if you're going to take sort of an out of research area position, you have to be prepared to learn a lot so that you can speak in a very sort of informed way. So it might be, if you believe that your strategic research direction will require you to extend your knowledge outside your core area to some other area, then maybe that out of area journal opportunity could be worth it if it aligns with your strategic career direction. But if it doesn't, I'd be pretty cautious about saying yes.
Thanks, Steve. We got one kind of a definition question. I think I'll just, in the interest of time, jump in and share that, which is what's the difference between these various editors we've talked about. So generally, journals work in a hierarchy. The editor-in-chief is what it says in chief. So that is the person ultimately responsible for the journal and the decisions rendered. Then there's usually, most journals have either area editors or department editors that report directly to the editor-in-chief. And each area or department has associate editors that are generally charged with managing the review process and getting reviewers and so on. In my journal, and I think it's probably true in all or most Informs journals, the associate editors are shielded in terms of that the authors do not know who they are, which is, you know, we had the question, well, should you think about doing this pre-tenure and even pre-full professor? Being an associate editor, you can get in some sticky positions with some high-powered people sometimes, but as an associate editor, you'll be fully shielded in that the authors will never know your identity. The area editors or department editors and editor-in-chief, there's no shield. They're out in the open. So you can, you know, have pros and cons of those interactions. So hopefully that helped that. So the next question I'd like to pose to our panelists is kind of, we've had a couple people talk about the relative pros and cons of going with a startup journal, a relatively new journal, something, you know, new and progressive versus an established journal. So I'd like you to weigh in on that. Maria, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it's pretty safe if the new journal is like a new journal within an established entity like Informs or like IISE. I think that is a pretty safe bet. You think that it might actually help you because you'll be in at the beginning that is getting launched. For a completely new journal outside, I think early on I wouldn't make that. I mean, personally, I probably wouldn't make that decision to join a journal that is new, that no one has ever heard of, the society that it comes from or anything like that. As you become full professor, then if you have the time and you're interested in it, then you can do kind of whatever you want. But I think that would be my advice.
Do any of the other panelists have anything to say on that issue?
Yeah, I have one very practical side to that, which is the bigger the name of the journal, the easier it is to get reviewers to say yes. I will, and that's a very practical thing to think about, and particularly this, Angela, you had a question about going out of field. I think that was, I wasn't sure it was Trevor's question. It's harder to get reviewers if they don't know the journal's name, or if you're out of field and they don't know your name, it makes it hard. And so it's just kind of, if you're trying to, the job is so hard as it is, that I feel like that makes it just that much harder.
Those are great answers. I do want to touch on a topic before we run out of time, which we're not going to yet, but we're getting there, which is really important because of what this panel is and who's sponsoring it. And that's kind of the whole spectrum of diversity and equity and bias and discrimination in journal editorial work. And I guess the question is, have you seen it? Have you experienced it? If you have, what has helped you to overcome it and also improve situations? And what advice would you offer to those of underrepresented groups who are facing the same challenge that you yourself might have gone through? So I'll open it up to whoever wants to jump in first. I'd like each of us or each of you to weigh on it because I think it's important. Okay, I have to call on someone. Michael, I'll call on you first because you're unmuted.
I have a few ideas about this, and I'm not, trying to enforce rules or name norms. I'm just saying common sense here. I'm African American, so I take an interest in submissions by members of underrepresented groups, including Black and African Americans. I care about that. I want to see more of it. I want to see more success. Right? That's a value judgment for me. What I also do, because of my identity, is have a special awareness of those who submit, who might be from underrepresented groups. It's there. I notice it. It would be foolish of me to pretend that it doesn't matter or that I don't notice it. I do. So I bring with me a progressive affirmative action ethic from my very earliest days in education, which is to say, I wish to support more diversity in topic areas, in impact, in authors, and I wish to do what I can to encourage the broadest set of submissions and to enable those who may not have had the advantages of submissions to good journals of others to have the opportunity to be successful. So that means I bring an awareness to my job, and I try to recognize and reward, recognize and uplift underrepresented voices where I can, while upholding commonly accepted standards of academic excellence.
Michael, I think that was beautifully put and covered a lot of things. Do Steve, Maria, or Karen, do you have something else you'd like to contribute on this really important topic?
Oh, go ahead, Maria.
Maria, go ahead, Maria.
What
We'll do the others.
What I was going to say, and I think there was a message sent to the panelists, is sometimes it's hard to know that you can be part of a group because you don't see yourself reflected in the group. So it may be that when you look at the list of the current editorial board, you don't see diversity in it. And diversity can also be defined, beyond race and ethnicity. You may think that the whole board is business school and I'm an engineering school. That means I can't be on the board, right? I'm talking broadly about this. So the first thing is, just because it is that way now, it doesn't mean that it was intentional. It just means that everyone invites people that they know. And so you tend to invite people that are like yourself. And informs specifically, and I think also now more broadly, a lot of the other societies are becoming more aware of this, are realizing that we have to be intentional in this, right? I think even a few years ago, there were no women editor-in-chiefs in the Informs journals, right? And so that has changed with time, but we have to be intentional about it. So the first thing is, if you don't see yourself reflected in there, don't think that it means that you can't be part of that group. And I think as far as other than that, yeah, I think Michael said everything else, so I'm not sure what else to add.
Karen, did you have
I was
something to
gonna say,
add?
I think and I think that concept of being intentional, and where you talked about, it has to go through the whole process. And Ruben, I hope this answers your question about making editorial jobs more attractive, because I'm excited about this. I think, the research shows the more transparent processes are, the better they are for diversity. And so when you see journals do things like reviewer templates or associate editor report templates, that's important, because then it removes a lot of this, oh, I know this person, so it must be good, and I'm just going to write, or I don't think this is very good, and I'm just going to write a really short referee report. But if we really are intentional about processes and we focus on the work, I think it's going to hopefully stop. I mean, you can't get rid of all of the favoritism and the way people react to the name of universities or big name authors, but processes help, transparency helps, and that's what gets me excited about the journal. And I think also, what Maria said about diversifying the editorial board, all of that, and kind of taking it across the whole process. So I'd love to see more of that in our journals.
Thanks. And Steve, thoughts on this?
Sure, I agree with all the nice points raised by people here. I want to make two further comments. One thing is, I just happened to do a little research on diversity. So what's good of diversity in terms of research? Then one interesting conclusion is diversity actually help to make the result more robust. In other words, with more diversity, you will have a less sensitive result, outliers, etc. Right? So you can. So in our diversity, not only good for the social reason, but also good for the scientific reasons. Okay. The second one is operation research as an informed flag journal. Indeed, try to do more in terms of diversity. For example, we constantly get email from the chief editor says that you should recruit, pay attention to women associate editors and the minority and the underrepresented groups in terms of founding associated. The other thing is we have lots of debate about whether we should have the paper totally anonymous or you have the author's name, right? So we have lots of debate says, okay, so if you have, like Manual Science, they have a totally anonymous mission, right? Whether it's good or bad, right? So you could have both things. People argue to the left, people argue right. For example, people say that if a big paper, totally anonymous, how do you help with the underrepresented groups, right? Because you don't see anything, right? Other people will say, okay, so if you make it anonymous, then whether you're a big name or not, you get same treatment in principle. I mean, in principle, not probably not in practice, but in principle. So what I'm trying to say in second point is journal like such as Operation Research indeed try to help a little bit in terms of achieve more diversity. Okay. Thank you.
Great. Michael, did you have something to add? I saw your hand up.
Yes. So some of us who do hiring may be aware in recent years, there's a bit of boilerplate that sometimes comes onto hiring statements that will say things like, we encourage applications from members of underrepresented groups. And I say boilerplate because those of us in the hiring business know that it's not always as it appears. But if you're serious about it, you're broadening the pool. And if you are serious about evaluating this broader pool fairly, you can make a difference. And so this goes to not seeing your face or your experience on editorial boards. And even a statement like this, if the journals are willing to back it up, we encourage submissions from persons of underrepresented groups. We encourage participation on the editorial board by persons from underrepresented groups. It could make a difference if you're willing to do the work to make those words real.
Thanks, Michael. So sadly, we're getting close to the end of our time, and I want to be sensitive about everyone's schedule. So let me say a couple things. First of all, a lot of great questions we didn't get to and discussion points, but again, we're planning some kind of forum in November, and maybe it can take a webinar form too. Let's see what happens. And the second thing is I'd like to invite each of our panelists to close, take a minute or so to close with any parting advice or I think advice is probably the best thing at this point to our attendees and those who will be viewing it afterwards by video. So I'm going to start with Steve because I don't think he got to go first yet. I'm trying to mix it up in my algorithmic head.
Okay, so one short sentence. If you have opportunity, join the editor board, and you should try your best to join if you have time permits you to do so. And of course, the more famous journal is, the more likely you should accept the invitation to join the editorial board.
Very good advice. Karen, how about you next?
Yeah, and don't be afraid to, we talked about asking questions about being an AE. If you write a review, you can ask the associate editor for feedback. I think that one of the best things about being in a journal, well, a good thing, I think the best thing is you see behind the scenes and you kind of get to know the system, but you don't know the system if you're on the outside. And it's okay to ask the associate editor, hey, was that a good referee report? Is there something I missed? I would definitely, there's no dumb questions. So go for it.
And Michael, any last advice?
Yeah, if you'd like to get involved, please do not hesitate to ask people who you think may know more than you about how to do it. I don't know about cold calling an editor-in-chief unless it's Karen Smilowitz. But I do believe in cold calling your colleagues because that's what we're here to do, is to help you grow your career.
Excellent. And Maria?
The only thing I would add is that service and the journals that you do service for might be valued differently in different departments. And so maybe it's also a good idea for you to talk to your department chair or people in your department to find out what might be valued there.
So my last piece of advice is to be proactive, but also be patient. So just because you say, oh, I'm here, I'm ready to serve on an editorial board. Sometimes those seeds have to be planted early and to move up also. So I was invited at the I got my PhD in 1991. I aged myself. And in 1995, I was invited to join Inform's Journal on Computing as associate editor, which I said yes. But it took me, I think, more than 15 years to become an area editor. And at that time, I had to be proactive. And then whatever it is, to be the editor in chief. So, don't feel like if it doesn't happen fast, it's not going to happen. And I think it's a mixture of building your reputation, knowing people can depend on you, knowing that you're going to honor your commitments and be timely and responsive. But at the same time, be proactive too and assertive and ask for advice, ask for feedback, ask for a leg up, as it were. So, and sometimes it's hard to balance that combination. I want to thank all the panelists. I learned a lot from listening to you guys, and I'm a little bit of a veteran in this, and it's really been a pleasure. And let's see where we go from this. Hopefully we've made some impact and we'll continue to do that. And thanks to the Inform staff for arranging it. It's worked out seamlessly.
Thanks to
Everyone,
my fellow panelists.
Thank you all. Bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Okay. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye now.